May 27, 1940. L'Épinette, France, near Dunkirk. Lieutenant Jack Churchill crouched in the rubble of a shattered farmhouse, watching a German patrol advance down the road approximately 150 yards away. Around him, his men from the Manchester Regiment waited tensely, expecting the order to open fire with rifles and machine guns in the conventional manner that the British Army had been fighting the war for the past 3 weeks of catastrophic retreat toward Dunkirk. But Jack Churchill had never been particularly interested in doing things in conventional ways. While his men checked their rifles, Churchill reached for a weapon that hadn't been used in combat by the British Army in over 200 years. A yew longbow, the same type of weapon English archers had used at Agincourt in 1415. Churchill had made the longbow himself, or rather, had acquired it from his pre-war hobby of competitive archery. He had brought it to France in his personal kit, along with a Scottish claymore sword and a set of bagpipes, because in Churchill's view, an officer who went into combat without proper weapons was improperly dressed. And proper weapons, in Jack Churchill's eccentric opinion, meant medieval armaments and musical instruments. His sergeant, a practical Lancashire man named Roberts, who had been trying to keep Churchill alive through 3 weeks of German blitzkrieg, whispered urgently, "Sir, respectfully, we have rifles, very good rifles, rifles that work at this range and won't give away our position by being completely insane." Churchill smiled, nocked an arrow, and drew the longbow to full extension. "Sergeant Roberts, there's nothing more demoralizing to an enemy than being shot with a weapon his ancestors feared 5 centuries ago. Also, I've been practicing with this bow since I was 12, and I can hit that German corporal from here." "Sir, that's 150 yards. "Indeed it is. Watch." Churchill aimed carefully, calculating windage and arrow drop with the same precision English longbowmen had used in medieval warfare. The German patrol was moving slowly, cautiously, expecting British forces to be retreating rather than preparing ambushes. The leading soldier, a German corporal, was exposed, clearly visible against the pale stone of a wall behind him. Churchill released. The arrow arced through the late afternoon air, descending in the graceful parabola that defines projectile motion, regardless of whether the projectile is an arrow or a bullet. The German corporal, who was about to become an unwilling participant in military history, had no idea he was being targeted until the arrow struck him in the chest, penetrating his uniform and knocking him to the ground. The other Germans in the patrol froze in shock and confusion. One of them had just been shot, that much was obvious. But shot with what? The sound had been wrong. No rifle crack, no machine gun burst, just a soft whistling followed by their comrade's scream. They couldn't identify where the shot had come from because there had been no muzzle flash, no report to locate. While the Germans stood confused, Churchill's men opened fire with conventional weapons, killing or wounding several more Germans before the patrol broke and retreated. The ambush had been successful tactically, but its significance extended beyond this small engagement on the road to Dunkirk. Lieutenant Jack Churchill had just achieved what is believed to be the last confirmed longbow kill in warfare. He had taken a weapon that had been obsolete for 3 centuries and proven it could still be effective, if only because enemies in 1940 had no idea how to respond to being attacked with archery. This was typical of Jack Churchill, the most eccentric British officer of World War II. Possibly the most eccentric British officer in any war, a man who would spend the next 5 years fighting Germans with swords, bagpipes, and absolute fearlessness while becoming a legend among commandos and a nightmare to enemy forces who encountered him and couldn't comprehend what they were facing. This is the story of Mad Jack Churchill, the commando who charged machine gun nests while playing bagpipes, who captured German soldiers by threatening them with a medieval broadsword, who survived concentration camps through audacity and escape attempts, and who famously complained when the war ended that if it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. This is the story of a man whose exploits sound like fiction but are documented fact, whose bravery was so extraordinary and methods so unconventional that history has struggled to know how to remember him, as a serious warrior or as an amusing eccentric, as a hero or as a madman, as an inspiration or as an anachronism. The answer, as with Jack Churchill himself, is that he was all of these things simultaneously, and that his story reveals truths about courage, morale, and the power of individual audacity that conventional military history often overlooks. To understand Mad Jack Churchill, we need to understand who he was before the war, what made him the kind of person who would bring medieval weapons to a modern conflict, and how his eccentricity translated into military effectiveness rather than just amusing anecdotes. John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill, Jack to friends and Mad Jack to everyone else, was born on September 16, 1906 in Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, where his father was a civil engineer working on colonial projects. Jack was raised in the tradition of the British Empire's administrative and military classes, public school education, emphasis on sports and military virtues, expectation of service to crown and country. But Jack was never conventional, even by the standards of early 20th century British military culture, which tolerated considerable eccentricity. He was intensely physical, excelled at sports, particularly enjoyed activities that other people considered dangerous or difficult. He learned archery as a boy and became competitive at it, achieving national-level skill with both longbow and recurve bow. He attended King William's College on the Isle of Man, then the Royal Military College Sandhurst, graduating as a British Army officer in 1926. He served in Burma with the Manchester Regiment, participated in various colonial policing operations, and seemed headed for a conventional, if unremarkable, military career. But in 1936, Churchill did something unusual. He resigned his commission and pursued a completely different career. He became a male model and a movie extra in Hollywood, appearing in several films including The Thief of Baghdad, 1940, where he played an archer. He also became an accomplished bagpiper, winning prizes at pipe competitions, and represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships. This interlude as a Hollywood extra and competitive archer might seem like an odd detour from military service, but it revealed important aspects of Churchill's character. He wasn't interested in conventional career paths. He pursued activities that interested him regardless of their practicality. He enjoyed physical challenges and public performance, and he was genuinely skilled at things most people considered archaic or eccentric: medieval weaponry, Scottish bagpipes, theatrical combat. When World War II began in September 1939, Churchill immediately rejoined the army. Britain needed officers, and Churchill's military training and leadership experience made him valuable despite his eccentric background. He was recommissioned as a lieutenant and assigned to the Manchester Regiment, which deployed to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force in early 1940. The British Expeditionary Force in France in spring 1940 encountered the German Blitzkrieg, the revolutionary combination of tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry that shattered French defenses and drove Allied forces toward the coast. British and French armies that had expected static warfare similar to World War I instead faced unprecedented mobile operations that rendered their defensive plans obsolete within days. The retreat to Dunkirk, where over 300,000 Allied troops were evacuated from beaches under German fire, was chaotic and desperate. Units fought rearguard actions to delay German advances, then withdrew toward the coast, fighting again, withdrawing again, slowly being compressed into an ever-shrinking perimeter. In this context, Churchill's longbow ambush was tactically insignificant. One German soldier killed in a campaign where thousands were dying daily. But psychologically, the incident revealed Churchill's approach to warfare. He didn't accept that modern war required only modern weapons. He believed that psychological impact mattered, that surprising enemies with unexpected tactics created advantages, and that personal audacity could influence battles beyond what firepower alone achieved. After Dunkirk, Churchill was assigned to the newly formed Commandos, special forces units designed for raiding operations against German-occupied Europe. The Commandos attracted officers and men who were aggressive, unconventional, and willing to take risks. Churchill fit perfectly. The Commando philosophy emphasized individual initiative, unconventional tactics, and bold action over careful planning. Commando raids were designed to harass German forces, gather intelligence, boost British morale, and demonstrate that Britain was still capable of offensive action despite having been driven from continental Europe. Churchill thrived in this environment. He was promoted to captain and given command of a commando troop, and he insisted on leading his men into combat in his own distinctive style, which meant charging into battle playing bagpipes, carrying a claymore sword, and treating warfare as something between a highland charge and a theatrical performance. His first major commando operation came in December 1941, Operation Archery, a raid on German positions at WW2’s, Norway. The operation's objective was to destroy German installations, capture prisoners for intelligence, and demonstrate British capability for offensive operations in occupied Norway. As the landing craft approached the Norwegian coast in pre-dawn darkness on December 27, 1941, the commandos prepared for the assault. Most were checking weapons, reviewing assignments, focusing on the dangerous work ahead. Churchill was playing The March of the Cameron Men on his bagpipes. Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, the overall operation commander, later recalled, "As we were going in, there was Churchill standing up in the boat, playing his pipes like he was leading a Highland regiment into battle at Culloden. The Germans must have thought we were completely insane, which in Churchill's case was probably accurate." The landing was opposed. German forces opened fire as the landing craft hit the beach. Commandos took casualties. The situation was confused and dangerous. This was exactly the kind of moment where leadership and morale mattered most. Churchill leapt from the landing craft, still playing his bagpipes, and charged directly toward the German positions. Behind him, his commandos, inspired, amused, and probably wondering if their officer was suicidal, followed. Churchill threw a grenade at a German position, drew his claymore sword, and continued the charge. The Germans, confronted with a sword-wielding maniac playing bagpipes while leading troops directly into their fire, broke and retreated. Not because the sword was an effective weapon against machine guns, it wasn't, but because Churchill's sheer audacity and the psychological impact of his attack disrupted German defensive cohesion. They were facing an enemy who behaved like no modern soldier should behave, and they didn't know how to respond. The WW2’s raid was successful. German installations were destroyed, prisoners were captured, and British forces withdrew with acceptable casualties. Churchill's leadership was noted in after-action reports, though his methods were described diplomatically as unconventional. Over 1942 and 1943, Churchill participated in multiple commando operations in Norway, Italy, and Yugoslavia. His reputation grew among British forces as an inspirational, if eccentric, leader, among German forces as a terrifying figure whose unpredictable tactics and apparent fearlessness made him dangerous beyond his actual combat power. The incident that became most famous occurred in 1943 in Italy at a German observation post near Salerno. Churchill's commando unit was tasked with capturing the position, which was held by approximately 42 German soldiers in fortified positions. A conventional approach would have been to call in artillery, soften up the position with bombardment, then assault with superior numbers and firepower. Churchill decided on a different approach. He would take the position himself, armed only with his sword, relying on speed and shock to overcome superior numbers. His plan was simple to the point of insanity. He would advance directly on the German position, sword drawn, moving fast enough that German soldiers wouldn't have time to organize effective response. When he reached the position, he would use the psychological impact of a sword attack and his command of German, Churchill spoke fluent German, to convince the Germans to surrender. His second-in-command tried to talk him out of it. "Sir, respectfully, that's suicide. There are 40-plus Germans up there with automatic weapons. You have a sword, a very nice sword, historically significant, but still just a sword." Churchill replied, "The sword is psychologically significant. Germans are trained to fear overwhelming force. I will represent overwhelming force through demonstration of complete confidence and lack of fear. Also, I'll be moving very fast, difficult target." Before anyone could stop him, Churchill advanced on the German position. He moved at a dead run, sword raised, shouting in German. The Germans, seeing a British officer charging them with a medieval weapon, froze momentarily in confusion. Before they could organize fire, Churchill had reached their position, was among them, sword swinging, shouting orders in German for them to surrender. The psychological shock was complete. One man with a sword had just charged a fortified position held by 40-plus soldiers, and instead of being killed, he was among them, apparently fearless, wielding a weapon that their military training had never prepared them to defend against. The Germans, confused and demoralized, surrendered. Churchill's men, arriving behind him, found their commander accepting the surrender of 42 German soldiers while holding only his claymore. It was one of the most extraordinary individual feats of the war, achieved through audacity and psychological warfare rather than firepower. The story spread through British forces and was embellished in the telling, until it became unclear what was true and what was legend. Had Churchill really captured 42 Germans with only a sword? The official records confirmed he had captured the position and taken prisoners, though exact numbers varied in different accounts. Churchill himself, when asked about the incident later, simply said, "They were quite reasonable once they understood their situation." By 1944, Jack Churchill had become a legend within British Commando forces. His reputation was such that German intelligence had identified him as a high-priority target. There were reports that German commanders had issued specific orders that the British officer who fought with bagpipes and sword was to be killed or captured if possible, as his psychological impact on German morale was considered disproportionate to his actual military rank. In May 1944, Churchill was given command of a force of British commandos assigned to support Yugoslav partisans fighting German occupation forces on the Adriatic island of Brač. The mission was to conduct raids, disrupt German operations, and assist partisan resistance efforts. Churchill approached this assignment with typical enthusiasm. He would finally have independent command of a significant force conducting extended operations rather than short raids. He could implement his tactical philosophy comprehensively: aggressive action, unconventional methods, personal leadership from the front. The operations on Brač initially went well. Churchill's commandos conducted successful raids, ambushed German patrols, and supported partisan operations. Churchill himself led from the front as always, often the first man into combat, playing bagpipes to signal attacks, wielding his sword when close combat occurred. But in May 1944, German forces on Brač were reinforced significantly as part of operations to suppress partisan activity in Yugoslavia. Churchill's relatively small commando force suddenly faced overwhelming German strength. Despite this, Churchill refused to withdraw, believing his force could continue effective operations through mobility and unconventional tactics. On the night of May 14, 1944, Churchill's position was surrounded by a much larger German force. A battle ensued that lasted through the night, with Churchill's commandos fighting desperately against superior numbers. Casualties mounted, ammunition ran low. By dawn, Churchill recognized that his position was untenable and that most of his men were already dead or captured. Rather than surrender conventionally, Churchill sat down on the ground, took out his bagpipes, and began playing "Will You No Come Back Again?", a melancholic Scottish tune about Bonnie Prince Charlie's failed Jacobite rebellion. He played as German soldiers approached, played as his remaining men were captured or killed, played until a German soldier hit him over the head with a rifle butt and knocked him unconscious. This image, a British officer sitting calmly playing bagpipes while his command collapsed around him and enemy soldiers approached to capture him, became one of the enduring scenes of Churchill's war. It exemplified his approach to warfare as something more than mere killing, as a contest of wills where maintaining composure and dignity under impossible circumstances was as important as tactical success. Churchill was taken prisoner and transported to Germany for interrogation. German intelligence was intensely interested in this British officer who had become infamous for his unconventional tactics. They interrogated him extensively, trying to determine if his eccentricity was genuine or a cover for some deeper intelligence operation. They seemed unable to comprehend that Churchill simply was exactly what he appeared to be, an officer who believed that medieval weapons and bagpipes were proper military equipment. After interrogation, Churchill was sent to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, one of the most notorious Nazi camps, located near Berlin. He was designated as a prominent, a high-value prisoner who might be useful for negotiations or propaganda. Prominent were held in slightly better conditions than other prisoners, but were closely guarded because of their potential value. Churchill was not content to remain imprisoned. Within weeks of arriving at Sachsenhausen, he was planning escape. This was characteristic. Churchill had never accepted limitations that others considered absolute. If he was imprisoned, then he would escape. The fact that Sachsenhausen was surrounded by multiple fences, guard towers, searchlights, and patrols was merely a tactical problem to be solved. In September 1944, an opportunity arose. During a power outage that darkened the camp's lights, Churchill and a British RAF officer slipped under the wire and escaped into the German countryside. They were recaptured after several days, but Churchill had demonstrated that even in a concentration camp, he would attempt aggressive action rather than passive acceptance. Following this escape attempt, Churchill was transferred to a prisoner of war camp in Austria, Stalag 81, where security was tighter and escape attempts were more difficult. He spent the winter of 1944-45 in captivity, frustrated by inactivity, plotting additional escape attempts. In April 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany and Austria, the SS began evacuating prisoner camps, often murdering prisoners rather than allowing them to be liberated. Churchill's camp was evacuated, with prisoners forced on a death march toward the Alps. During this evacuation, Churchill escaped again. He simply walked away from the column during confusion, found a Wehrmacht supply depot, acquired vegetables and a can, and began walking westward toward what he believed were American lines. He walked for approximately 150 miles over 8 days, living off stolen vegetables and the occasional assistance from Austrian civilians who either didn't recognize him as an escaped British prisoner or didn't care. Churchill eventually encountered American forces near the town of Verona in Italy. His appearance shocked the American soldiers who first saw him. A tall, disheveled British officer walking calmly down a road carrying a bag of onions, claiming to be a commando colonel who had escaped from a German prisoner camp and walked across Austria. The Americans were skeptical until Churchill's identity was verified through military channels. He was flown back to Britain, arriving in May 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending. His first comment upon arriving, according to witnesses, was disappointment. If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years. This comment, which has become Churchill's most famous quote, revealed his attitude toward warfare. He genuinely enjoyed combat, viewed it as the highest expression of courage and skill, and regretted that the war was ending because it meant return to peacetime military service that he found boring. After Germany's surrender, Churchill immediately requested transfer to Burma, where fighting against Japan continued. He wanted to participate in combat operations and was frustrated that the European war had ended. The British Army, recognizing Churchill's eagerness and capabilities despite his eccentricity, assigned him to Burma in summer 1945. Churchill arrived in Burma in August 1945 and was preparing for operations when Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II was over. Churchill's war was over, and he was profoundly disappointed. His post-war career continued in military service, but the peacetime army offered few opportunities for the kind of aggressive, unconventional operations Churchill thrived in. He served in various positions, learned to surf while stationed in Australia, becoming one of the first British officers to practice surfing, and taught land-air warfare tactics at military schools. But Churchill was out of place in peacetime military service. His methods were tolerated during wartime when results mattered more than conformity. In peacetime, when proper procedure and bureaucratic compliance became paramount, Churchill's eccentricities were viewed less as assets and more as problems. He retired from the military in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. His retirement was quiet, with minimal ceremony. The man who had charged machine gun nests with a sword and captured dozens of Germans single-handedly simply stopped being a soldier one day and became a civilian. Churchill's post-war life was unremarkable. He worked briefly as a land agent in Australia, then retired to Surrey, England. He sailed, surfed, even in his 60s, and built and operated a radio-controlled model boats. He gave occasional interviews about his wartime experiences, but generally avoided publicity. He died on March 8, 1996, at age 89, his obituaries in British newspapers were lengthy and detailed, recounting his extraordinary wartime exploits. But the tone of the obituaries was uncertain. Should Mad Jack Churchill be remembered as a serious military hero, or as an amusing eccentric, as someone whose methods should be studied and emulated, or as someone whose success was despite rather than because of his unconventional approach? This uncertainty reflects broader questions about how military history treats individuals who succeed through methods that defy conventional wisdom. Churchill's tactics, charging with swords, playing bagpipes under fire, relying on psychological impact over firepower, shouldn't have worked according to military doctrine. Yet they did work repeatedly, across multiple operations. Why did Churchill's methods work? Several factors contributed. Psychological impact. Modern soldiers are trained to respond to modern threats. Encountering an enemy using tactics from 5 centuries ago creates cognitive dissonance that disrupts defensive procedures. German soldiers didn't have protocols for responding to bagpipe-playing officers wielding swords because such threats were outside the paradigm of modern warfare. Morale and leadership. Churchill's personal courage was undeniable. When soldiers saw their commander charging directly into enemy fire with only a sword, playing bagpipes under artillery bombardment, accepting no excuse for retreat or failure, they were inspired to match that courage. Churchill's eccentricity translated into leadership effectiveness because men would follow someone whose bravery was so absolute. Surprise and initiative. Churchill's tactics were unpredictable, which gave him initiative. German forces couldn't prepare for attacks that came from directions and in manners that doctrine said were impossible. This constant surprise prevented Germans from establishing effective defensive routines. Speed and aggression. Churchill moved faster and more aggressively than conventional tactics recommended. This speed and aggression often overwhelmed defenses before they could organize response. The sword charges that seemed suicidal worked because Churchill closed distance before Germans could bring effective fire to bear. Personal skill. Churchill was genuinely skilled with his weapons. He was a champion archer, a trained swordsman, an accomplished bagpiper. His medieval weapons weren't just props or psychological tools. He could actually use them effectively in combat at ranges and in situations where they were tactically appropriate. These factors combined to make Churchill's unconventional approach successful more often than military doctrine would predict. But success doesn't mean his methods should be universally emulated. Churchill's tactics worked for Churchill, with his specific skills, personality, and context. Other officers who tried to copy his methods without his capabilities would likely have failed catastrophically. The military lessons from Churchill's career are subtle. His example doesn't teach that officers should fight with swords instead of rifles. It teaches that psychological factors in warfare are real and consequential, that personal leadership matters, that unconventional approaches can succeed when they exploit enemy expectations, and that individual audacity can have disproportionate impact in specific tactical situations. Modern Special Forces training incorporates some of these lessons. Special operations emphasize psychological warfare, unconventional tactics, and aggressive personal leadership, all characteristics of Churchill's approach. While Special Forces don't use swords and bagpipes, they do understand that surprising enemies with unexpected tactics creates advantages. Churchill's influence on commando culture specifically was significant. He exemplified the commando ethos: aggressive action, personal courage, unconventional thinking, refusal to accept limitations. Stories of Mad Jack were told in commando training, not necessarily as tactical instruction, but as inspiration, as examples of what extraordinary courage and determination could accomplish. But Churchill also remained somewhat controversial within military circles. Some officers viewed him as a dangerous eccentric whose success was despite rather than because of his methods, whose tactics endangered his men, and whose example encouraged recklessness rather than disciplined courage. This criticism has merit. Churchill's methods were inherently risky. The sword charges that succeeded could easily have resulted in his death and the failure of his missions. His insistence on aggressive action in Yugoslavia led to the destruction of his command and his capture. His escape attempts, while brave, endangered other prisoners and provoked German reprisals. A balanced assessment recognizes both Churchill's extraordinary courage and the fact that his methods worked partially through luck and partially through specific circumstances that don't generalize easily. He was genuinely heroic, genuinely effective, and genuinely exceptional. But exceptional individuals don't necessarily provide templates for general practice. The question of why Churchill remains underappreciated compared to other World War II heroes relates to this uncertainty about how to categorize him. Military historians struggle with figures who don't fit established categories. Churchill was clearly brave. His decorations and combat record prove that, but his bravery was expressed through methods that seem more theatrical than tactical, more amusing than serious. Popular histories tend to present Churchill as an amusing anecdote, the eccentric who fought with medieval weapons, the character who adds color to the serious business of war. This framing diminishes his actual combat effectiveness and the genuine fear he inspired in enemy forces. Academic military history tends to ignore or minimize Churchill because his methods don't fit into analytical frameworks about firepower, logistics, and doctrine that dominate serious military analysis. An officer who captured Germans with a sword doesn't fit easily into discussions of combined arms operations or strategic bombing campaigns. But Churchill's story deserves serious consideration precisely because it challenges conventional assumptions about warfare. He demonstrated that psychological factors matter, that individual audacity can have strategic consequences, that courage expressed in unconventional ways can be as effective as courage expressed in conventional ways. His story also humanizes warfare in ways that purely tactical histories don't. Churchill wasn't a distant strategic genius or a faceless soldier. He was a vivid personality whose methods reflected his character, whose choices were idiosyncratic rather than doctrine-driven, whose war experience was intensely personal and individually distinctive. For soldiers who served with Churchill, memories of Mad Jack were central to their war experiences. They remembered the colonel who played bagpipes under fire, who charged with a sword, who never accepted defeat or retreat. These memories shaped how they understood courage, leadership, and their own contributions to the war. For German soldiers who encountered Churchill, he became a figure of almost mythical terror. Post-war interviews with German veterans who fought in areas where Churchill operated revealed that stories of the sword-wielding bagpiper had spread widely and had significantly affected German morale. German soldiers developed almost superstitious fear of encountering the Highland madman who seemed to ignore bullets and who captured positions through sheer audacity. This psychological impact was real military effect, as significant in its way as killing enemy soldiers or destroying equipment. An enemy force that fears encountering specific units or commanders becomes less effective, more cautious, more prone to retreat or surrender. Churchill's reputation created that effect. The personal cost to Churchill of his wartime experiences is worth noting. While he survived physically relatively intact, the psychological toll of combat, capture, and imprisonment affected him. Post-war, Churchill struggled with periods of depression and restlessness. The excitement of wartime operations had provided meaning and purpose that peacetime life couldn't match. This pattern, wartime peak experiences followed by post-war letdown, affected many veterans, but it was particularly acute for someone like Churchill, whose personality was so suited to combat. He had found his ideal environment in warfare, had excelled at it, had gained recognition and purpose through it. Peacetime couldn't provide equivalent satisfaction. His comment about wishing the war had continued another 10 years, while often quoted as amusing eccentricity, reflected genuine psychological reality. Churchill had been happier in war than in peace, had found war meaningful in ways that peace wasn't. This is uncomfortable truth that challenges civilian assumptions about warfare. Some people genuinely thrive in combat, find in it expressions of courage and capability that civilian life can't provide. This doesn't make war good or desirable. War remains terrible waste of human potential and life. But individuals like Churchill complicate simple narratives about all soldiers suffering in war and welcoming peace. Some soldiers suffer in war but suffer differently in peace, missing the intensity and purpose that combat provided despite recognizing its horrors. Churchill's legacy today is mixed. He is remembered, celebrated in some circles, largely forgotten in others. Military historians note him as an interesting character, but struggle to assign him significance beyond anecdote. Special Forces communities remember him as an inspiring example of unconventional warfare. Popular culture occasionally rediscovers him, fascinated by the incongruity of a World War II officer fighting with medieval weapons. But he deserves to be remembered more seriously than as merely an amusing eccentric. Jack Churchill demonstrated several important truths about warfare, courage, and human potential. Individual courage matters. Even in industrial-scale modern warfare, individual actions can have disproportionate impact. Churchill's personal bravery inspired his men, demoralized enemies, and influenced outcomes of specific engagements. Psychological warfare is real. The effect Churchill had on German morale through his unconventional tactics was measurable military consequence. Warfare isn't just about firepower, it's about will, morale, confidence, fear. Unconventional approaches can succeed. Churchill's methods worked despite violating military doctrine because they exploited enemy expectations and created situations where doctrinal responses were inadequate. Leadership is personal. Churchill didn't lead through careful planning or superior resources. He led through personal example, through being visibly braver and more audacious than anyone else. His men followed him because they saw his courage and felt compelled to match it. Personality matters in warfare. Military organizations try to create uniformity, to train all soldiers to behave similarly. But exceptional individuals like Churchill show that personality, idiosyncrasy, and individual characteristics can be military assets when properly channeled. These lessons don't mean modern militaries should train soldiers to fight with swords. They mean that rigid adherence to doctrine, suppression of individual initiative, and dismissal of unconventional approaches can eliminate capabilities that, while rare and difficult to systematize, can be genuinely valuable. Jack Churchill was one of a kind. There was no one else like him in World War II, probably no one else like him in any war. His combination of skills, courage, eccentricity, and effectiveness was unique, but unique doesn't mean irrelevant. His story provides lessons about the limits of conventional military thinking and the possibilities of individual audacity. The man who fought World War II with a longbow, a claymore sword, and bagpipes was not a myth or a legend, despite stories that sound mythical. He was a real person who did real things that were documented by witnesses, recorded in official reports, and confirmed by both Allied and German sources. He really did kill a German soldier with a longbow in 1940. He really did charge German positions playing bagpipes and wielding a sword. He really did capture dozens of German soldiers armed only with a claymore. He really did sit playing mournful tunes on his pipes as his command was destroyed around him. He really did escape from Sachsenhausen concentration camp. He really did walk 150 miles across Austria to Allied lines. All of this happened. All of it was witnessed and recorded, and all of it was accomplished by one man whose approach to warfare was so unconventional, so seemingly impossible, that history has struggled to know how to remember him. Perhaps the best way to remember Jack Churchill is simply to tell his story accurately, without embellishment, but also without diminishing its extraordinary nature. Let the facts speak for themselves. A British officer fought World War II with medieval weapons, succeeded repeatedly through audacity and psychological warfare, survived capture and imprisonment, and lived to age 89, having experienced one of the most unusual military careers in history. Mad Jack Churchill, commando, eccentric, hero, and living proof that individual courage expressed in unconventional ways can achieve extraordinary results even in the mechanized warfare of the 20th century. A reminder that war, despite its industry and technology, remains fundamentally a human activity where personality, courage, and audacity matter as much as firepower and logistics. the last man to kill an enemy with a longbow in warfare, the officer who captured Germans with a sword, the commando who played bagpipes under fire, the prisoner who escaped concentration camps, the man who wished the war had continued because he found in combat a purpose and intensity that peacetime couldn't match. That was Jack Churchill. Remarkable, unconventional, effective, and underappreciated precisely because his story seems too extraordinary to be true, even though every word of it is documented fact. A soldier who proved that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the most modern or powerful, but the one wielded with absolute courage by someone who refuses to accept that the impossible is impossible. Mad Jack Churchill, the commando with a longbow and sword, the man who fought the 20th century's most modern war with tactics from the 15th century and succeeded because courage, audacity, and psychological impact transcend era and technology. A legend who was real, a hero who was eccentric, a warrior who was unique. His story deserves to be remembered not just as amusing anecdote, but as serious military history. History that teaches that human factors in warfare remain paramount regardless of technology, that individual courage can have strategic consequences, and that sometimes the most effective way to fight is the way no one expects and no doctrine anticipates. Jack Churchill proved that. Proved it with bagpipes and swords, with arrows and audacity, with courage that seemed insane but was actually supremely calculated psychological warfare. The man who volunteered for every dangerous mission, who never retreated, who captured enemy soldiers with medieval weapons, and who survived the war to complain that it ended too soon. That is Mad Jack Churchill's legacy, and it deserves to be remembered, studied, and honored as an example of what exceptional individuals can accomplish when courage, skill, and absolute fearlessness combine to create capabilities that conventional military thinking says shouldn't exist but that undeniably did.